Greetings and welcome back, gentles and ladiesmen, to another exciting EPG review. I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and it's high time we revisited the Ratchet and Clank series. Before we do, I'd like to get two things out of the way right now. 1. I have not seen the movie yet. 2. I have not played the PS4 game yet, largely because I don't own a PS4. That being said, it's finally time to talk about Ratchet and Clank Future Tools of Destruction for the PlayStation 3. Is this high-definition installment a worthy follow-up to the PS2 trilogy? Let's find out.
But Mike, what about Ratchet Deadlocked?
NickonAquaMagna, what are you doing here?
I exist in all spaces.
But I thought you were hard at work on your upcoming review of the Metroid Prime trilogy.
Oh yeah, about that. I'm trying out this crazy new thing called Summer. Turns out it's really good for you. I might try it next year too. Don't change the subject. Why are you leaving out this perfectly legitimate entry in the classic Ratchet and Clank series?
Ratchet Deadlocked? I've never played it. Is it any good?
Oh yeah, it's great. In fact, I'm playing it right now. Let's review it together.
Might as well. Perhaps having a more seasoned opinion on this game will help to round things out. Alright, anecdote time. Back in late 2011 and 2012, I used to visit a video game store called Play and Trade a couple towns over. This place sold newer games on modern systems, but it also had an impressive assortment of retro games. People could trade in their used games, consoles, and accessories for store credit, cash, or other merchandise. Given their selection and nearby location, Play and Trade became my offline retro game store of choice. Sure, you can get exactly what you want on eBay and Amazon, but shopping for retro in person is like a box of chocolates. You never quite know what you're gonna get. Unfortunately, my local Play and Trade closed down just before I came back home from college a couple years ago, which was, coincidentally, when I started my original Ratchet and Clank marathon. Well, my point in bringing this up is that Play and Trade was where I purchased most of my PS2 collection, with a few exceptions. I remember seeing Ratchet Deadlocked on a shelf filed next to the other RNC games on PS2, staring at the cover and instantly thinking of games like Jak 2 or Shadow the Hedgehog. After all, Ratchet Deadlocked came out in that same time frame, where mature shooters suddenly took over the market. Point is, the seemingly edgier tone of the cover art with its dark, undersaturated colors and an edgy looking Ratchet standing next to a couple of homicidal robots turned me off from purchasing the game. At best, Deadlocked seemed like a spin-off that wasn't really relevant to the events of the Future series, which I was much more interested in playing at the time. So I skipped on Deadlocked and jumped straight into Tools of Destruction, which is ironically much more lighthearted than the previous entries. So now, thanks to the suggestion of my colleague here, I finally have an excuse to play this game in full and see if it's worth checking out.
Ratchet Deadlocked was one of the earliest Ratchet and Clank games I got to play. The first was Tools of Destruction, which my little bro and I got for our PS3 back in the day, and I loved the game. Shortly after, I found used copies of the original Ratchet and Clank and Ratchet Deadlocked for the PS2 and bought them together. And a month or so later, I got going commando and Up Your Arsenal until I was beyond hyped for a cracking time. I was a full-blown fan. I feel these first three games together introduced me to a little of everything the series is about, and they were all very different. Ratchet Deadlocked is kind of the middle child of the Ratchet and Clank series. It doesn't get as much attention as those that came before or after. Hopefully I can show you guys why I love this game.
This is Ratchet Deadlocked for the PlayStation 2. The plot picks up shortly after the events of Up Your Arsenal. Ratchet has become captain of the Starship Phoenix, with Commander Sasha having become mayor of Metropolis. Sasha calls to inform Ratchet of the death of Captain Starshield, a hero who went missing a month ago. Her intelligence suggests that Starshield was abducted and forced to compete on Dreadzone, a black market holovision program spearheaded by the villainous Gleeman Vox. Operating in the shadow sector of the Solana Galaxy, Dreadzone sees its contestants overcoming death course after deathmatch to compete with other gladiators for the prospect of their freedom.
Or at the very least, fame and fortune. It's a pretty cynical game.
And wouldn't you know it, Ratchet, Clank, and Big Al are captured by Vox's forces then and there, as they've apparently drifted into the shadow sector. Ratchet is immediately fitted with a deadlock collar, which will shock him or even explode his head if he refuses to comply with Vox's orders. While Clank and Al work on a plan to escape Dreadzone and free the other contestants, Ratchet must compete for his very life as he works his way up through the ranks and survives a seemingly endless onslaught of robotic butchers, savage monsters, and crazed competition. In summary, the plot is essentially the same same as The Running Man, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger. You know, that movie that the Hunger Games ripped off? After getting captured by local authorities, the protagonist is forced to compete on a game show hosted by a corrupt capitalist for the possibility of surviving and going home free. In both the film and the game, the media lies about the identity of the protagonist to turn the audience against them. The audience ultimately changes their mind when the protagonist's allies engineer a plan to undermine the antagonist's operation.
Here he is, ready to pay the price for our home audience. In person, the Butcher of Bakersfield!
The Butcher of Bogon has his work cut out for him this time, Juanita. He starts the round with only a wrench for protection.
Now, to be clear, Ratchet Deadlocked does do a number of things differently from The Running Man in terms of plot, but compared to the stories in the previous 3 games, it feels like we're backpedaling a little. Based on the game's premise alone, you have a pretty good idea of how Deadlocked is going to end, especially if you've seen The Running Man. Compare that to Going Commando, where you were never quite sure what was going to happen next. It's an intriguing plot, and it gets the job done, but it didn't really leave me with much of a lasting impression.
Yeah, I won't pretend Deadlocked's plot is amazing, but I do appreciate what a strange turn it is for the series. Up until now, the threats have been getting bigger and grander in scale, naturally, but they dialed it back in this game, limiting the scope to Ratchet and the gang, making it more personal and the danger more immediate. The galaxy may not be under siege this time, but in terms of the threat to the lives of these characters we've now spent years adventuring with, this is one of the most dire situations Ratchet and Clank have ever been in. One thing that does disappoint me is this is the last time we ever see Sasha. She doesn't appear in any future games with an updated character model or anything, though she does get mentioned by a pirate in Tools of Destruction. She does return to play an important role in a comic that takes place shortly before All for One, but in terms of the games, this opening cutscene is the last time we'll ever see her, and that kinda stings. It is nice of them to include her, but it's too bad they didn't also whip up at least one still shot for the ending credits, where you see her happy that her friends are safe and all that, giving her and the PS2 era of Ratchet and Clank games a heartfelt send-off. Oh well.
I also have a hard time suspending my disbelief on a number of plot points. For example, Vox has the ability to blow up Ratchet's head at any time with the push of a button, yet declines to do so on a number of obvious occasions. And you'd think that he would, seeing as Vox becomes visibly frustrated when Ratchet's popularity starts to undermine his Ace Hardlight merchandising operation.
Well, he probably would have if Ratchet didn't play ball early in the game, but as Ratchet's popularity rose, Vox became determined to make him a ratings machine and squeeze the Lombax for everything he's worth. With Ace's own popularity waning, Vox can't afford to lose both of his potential icons, and he chose Ratchet.
Alright, fair enough. I'm also curious about how it is that the President and the Galactic Rangers never knew about Dread Zone before this point, even though little kids can apparently tune into this program very easily and quickly learn that it's transparently illegal. The game also doesn't do a good job explaining how Dread Zone is illegal and underground, while something like Annihilation Nation is apparently A-OK.
It's probably something that mostly airs in places where the government's control is pretty lax and people could tune in through a secret frequency. In fact, all the planets Dread Zone takes place on, including Orxon from the first game, could be like the Outer Rim from Star Wars, where the Republic and then the Empire don't have as much control as they do on the core worlds near the center of the galaxy, and these backwater planets are basically free game for warlords and rich sleazeballs to abuse. Also, you have to remember, there is one big difference between Dread Zone and Annihilation Nation. In legal game shows like that, the gladiators volunteer to participate. Vox's goons kidnap people and force them to compete until they die. I guess normal blood sports of fellow galactic protocol grew too boring for some people, creating a market for the edgier, more brutal Dread Zone. Dread Zone is basically one giant glorified snuff film. You can watch it, but you'd probably have to access it through shady means and be a total sicko to even want to watch it.
Alright, I guess you've got a point there. None of these things are really that big of a deal in the grand scheme of things, but I still think Ratchet Deadlocked's plot could benefit from a tighter script that explains some of these smaller points in a little more detail. Actually, I think that a couple simple rewrites would do the trick. Like, say the story was set in a new galaxy that Ratchet and Company happened to visit while searching for Captain Starshield, only to get captured by Vox's goons. Perhaps in this galaxy, which lacks essential authority, Vox's media empire fills the gap, allowing him to have his way with the inhabitants on Dread Zone.
Yeah, I can see that happening. I guess they didn't want to go that far since they were already moving forward to a new galaxy in the next game.
Yeah, I suppose that makes sense. As long as I'm talking about the small things I didn't like about the plot, I ought to bring attention to the things that I did enjoy. I'm happy to say that while Ratchet Deadlocked is slightly edgier in tone than its predecessors, it still feels very much like a Ratchet and Clank game. The presentation and voice acting are still top-notch, the writing has that same snappy wit to it, the satire is as biting as as ever.
6 million bolts of hardware down the drain, and those ingrates are celebrating like I won the freaking lottery.
Remind me why I put up with these morons. Who else would watch Vox News?
There's a score of references to the previous games, and the commentary on the dark side of capitalism present in the first 2 games returns here. I was afraid that Deadlocked would do to Ratchet's character what Jak 2 did to Jack's, but I'm happy to say that he's still very much the same Lombax he was in Going Commando and Up Your Arsenal. He's a cocky but determined commando who aims to protect his friends and is happy to see justice done. What's also kind of fun is that despite the fact that Ratchet's in mortal danger, he does seem to genuinely enjoy the idea of being a famous Dread Zone gladiator, which I really like. The Ratchet from the other games would totally react this way.
To be fair, Ratchet does have a few moments where he starts to sink into a dark place, and you wonder how much Dread Zone is going to affect him if he ever does get out. Seeing how his changed Ace Hardlight, who was once a hero like Ratchet but has become a sort of dark mirror of how he could very well turn out, is enough to pull him back to the light, until he outright rejects everything about Dread Zone and Ace's world. It's a test of his character and he comes out on top. If his chipper demeanor in future games is anything to go by, I'd say he's coped with this ordeal pretty well.
The new characters, most notably Dread Zone anchors Dallas and Juanita, were also well characterized and memorable for the most part. Gleeman Vox didn't do much for me at first, but I did eventually warm up to him. I questioned some of his decisions in the late game, but other than that, he does his job quite well. At the very least, he's got a great character design.
Yeah, I love that this money-hungry mogul is a shark. You know, like a loan shark. He's not trying to take over the galaxy or whatever, he lives and dies by a ratings chart. I admit, my appreciation for this character is largely owed to Michael Bill's performance. He's the guy who voices Lawrence. With his other performances usually so underplayed, it's a treat to listen to him lose it here. Dude's got some range. The other characters are pretty fun too.
Surprisingly, I really liked Ratchet's BattleBots too. At first they didn't really do much for me, but as the game goes on, you really start to feel a sense of camaraderie with these little guys. There's one level where your BattleBots are imprisoned and you have to rescue them one by one, and I was surprisingly invested in getting them free.
Yeah, these guys are legit. Merc and Green managed to endear me more than the Galactic Rangers ever did, through their commentary and just how effective they are during gameplay as you upgrade them. They kinda made it a joke in the last game that after a while, the Rangers take you for granted and expect you to do all the work. Bunch of flakes. These guys are more genuine, and they got your back from beginning to end, and it's certainly appreciated. On Torval, there's this one mission where if you go to a certain area, Green will tell you about a long-lost love he has and wars he's been in. It's good stuff. And the tension between Dallas and Juanita...
Ooh, and the whole mommy baby thing, sexy. Baby needs a changing.
It's almost bearable. Their commentary, while repetitive at times, is also pretty good thanks to their VA's performances. And one more thing. Am I the only one who finds it freaky as all shit that Juanita has normal human eyes in the movie? Dallas, look at him. They left out his hairpiece and he just looks like a generic alien dude without it. And these two are legitimate reporters now. Yeah, right. Back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Nick. While the plot is definitely pretty predictable for the most part, the build-up is still pretty strong. The rivalry between Ratchet and Grand Champion / former hero Ace Hardlight is set up very well, and it gives you the extra motivation to push through all the death courses and eventually take the bastard on in the last tournament. Overall, Ratchet Deadlocked is above average for the series in terms of plot, but it still stands well for a spin-off RNC game. And it is admittedly a nice break from saving the galaxy over and over again. Ratchet Deadlocked was Insomniac's last game on the PS2, and it really shows graphically. Technically, the game supports widescreen and progressive scan, making the visuals about as advanced as it gets for PlayStation 2. While Ratchet himself looks pretty different in his Dread Zone battlesuit, the overall art direction is pretty consistent with that of the previous games. Character models are top tier for PlayStation 2, and the animations feature the same attention to detail that Insomniac is known for. My only complaint in that regard is that Ratchet's running animation does seem to lack that hypnotic sway from the first 3 games, but that's a minor point.
Yeah, he is a little robotic in this one.
While the environments are definitely grayer and browner than the previous games, they still have a much more vibrant color palette than something like Jak 2. Regarding the planets you visit, there isn't too much new here, but the settings do at least have some diversity. Regarding the soundtrack, David Bergo returns to the musician's chair, this time offering an edgier score than the more cinematic tracks of the second and third games. It matches Deadlocked's darker setting and plot perfectly. There's more of a rock and roll edge to this game than the previous entries, and it really accentuates the over-the-top carnage happening on screen. I don't think it's quite as memorable as Going Commando or Up Your Arsenal, but I'm sure that after I listen to the soundtrack on YouTube a couple of times, I'll probably change my mind on that point. Additionally, the sound design is top-notch, making combat that much more satisfying than it would have been otherwise. Overall, Ratchet Deadlocked is well up to par with previous games in the series in terms of the visuals and audio, embracing its darker tone while still looking and sounding like a Ratchet and Clank game.
For me, the soundtrack is good, but a little spotty. Some of the tunes are okay for building an atmosphere, but don't really stick with you. Others are downright hectic, conveying a sense of panic and mayhem to change things up, but the best tunes are usually the ones that play near the end of a world. Some good examples include the Valak spell to let the light shine through, Torval's to turn on, and Stygia's energy collector, though that plays a little early in its campaign. These tunes are all very effective at getting across just how desperate some of these scenarios get, how down to the wire victory really is. They make you feel like you're lucky to make it at all, let alone save anyone else. The most effective tune in the entire soundtrack has gotta be Escape, the final mission on the Ghost Station. Man, the Ghost Station, just that name is badass. Most of this campaign plays it pretty straight in terms of gameplay and music. Once you turn the tide and get to clean things up with the hover ship, you get to listen to this. Beautiful. This is easily my favorite tune in the game, and one of my favorite pieces in the whole series, like top 5 material. It's one of the more emotional pieces and strangely upbeat for what has got to be one of the most perilous moments of our heroes' careers. All of the tunes I've mentioned are worth listening to, and there's others you might enjoy as well. It's definitely a departure from the music of past games, but it does well being its own thing. It didn't hit me that hard at first, but I've come to appreciate it over the years. Graphically, Michael and I are pretty much on the same page.
Things are pretty familiar in the gameplay department. The gunplay is virtually unchanged from Up Your Arsenal. Right off the bat, you're given a choice between a traditional Ratchet and Clank control scheme, a typical dual analog scheme, and a first-person scheme. You start out with a blaster weapon and a shotgun weapon, but defeating enemies will earn you bolts that you can use at Dread Zone vendors to purchase new weapons and mods that will add extra features to said weapons. Defeating enemies will earn experience points to increase Ratchet's health bar, while successfully landing shots on enemies will eventually level up that weapon, increasing the damage output and unlocking a new alpha mod slot. The gameplay itself is as over-the-top and satisfying as ever, pulled together by tight responsive control and satisfying visual effects. If you enjoyed the combat in the previous games, you'll enjoy it in Ratchet Deadlocked as well.
One thing Deadlocked does that is pretty different from the previous games is this new modding system. You've got alpha mods and omega mods. Omega mods are what you'd expect. Acid injected rounds, extra bombs, napalm. Some mods work much better with certain weapons and even in different situations. For example, if you equip the acid mod to a weapon that fires slow shots, you're not going to get that much mileage out of the extra damage. If you equip it to a more rapid fire weapon like the 12 Vipers, that can double or even triple the damage. And that's good and all if you want to drain a larger enemy's health with continuous fire, but I find myself using the shock mod more often with these weapons. The shots are just strong enough to take down pretty much all of the smaller enemies, and the resulting shock will take out several, even dozens of other nearby grunts. This is a good way to clear a room of a swarm. Sure, being able to turn enemies into farm animals or make them fight each other is fun and all, but I find myself using the more practical mods like freezing or napalm. Freezing is great for weapons like the magma cannon since its shots tend to converge and home in on enemies, and the Leviathan flail which outright shatters them. Napalm works best for weapons like the Hunter Mine since most if not all of the residue will cling to enemies that survive the initial blast. And the mini bomb and time bomb mods are great for the already more explosive weapons like the Arbiter. They can be almost as effective as the Bouncer was in other games, though equipping the freeze mod to the Harbinger is probably the most satisfying combo of all, since it looks like it's instantly turning them to glass. Then there's alpha mods. This is where things get interesting. These will increase your weapon's rate of fire, blast radius, ammo capacity, even auto-targeting, but that's pretty basic stuff. They're super expensive, but like Exo said earlier, your weapons are automatically equipped with a new one pretty much every time they level up all the way to level 10. But you know what's even better? You can unequip these mods from one weapon and attach them to any other weapon. You can put all of your collected speed mods on a weapon to make it fire super fast, or make their explosions super big. You have lots of options, it's great. The best mods of all, though, are the bonus mods. These will increase the bolts or XP you gain by 25%, which means if you equip a second one to that same weapon, they increase 25% of 125, and then 156, and then 195, and so on. You can't even buy these before challenge mode, but keep an eye on your weapons since you'll eventually acquire 1 or 2 of each by leveling up, and then you can just attach them to whichever gun you want to level up slightly faster. Challenge mode is where the real fun begins. Once you can buy more of these mods at your leisure, it becomes a very different game. So here's my top 5 favorite levels to grind for experience points. Monuments of Death. Whack-a-Swimmer.
Darkstar is in rare form tonight.
Refinery Ambush. Your Land is My Land. This course has a lot of bigger enemies and is one of the best places to upgrade weapons like the Harbinger. But there is one place that's even better. Heavy Metal. This is probably the best place in the entire game to come back to for experience points. You can get a ton of XP here in no time. This challenges everything. Most of the enemies are huge, the arena is fairly small so it's easy to light up the place, and even zombies start piling in near the end. This place is even more fun to come back to in challenge mode. If you've collected a good amount of bonus XP mods by now, and you apply them all to a single weapon, oh my gosh, you will level up so fast it's downright ludicrous compared to other games in the series. Just look at that XP bar. One of my challenge mode playthroughs ended here. I didn't even finish it. I just maxed out all of my weapons in like half an hour and felt completely fulfilled, like I just stumbled upon Nirvana or something. I think I might have a problem. On another note, End Zone is the best challenge to milk for bolts. All you need to do is set up a few mini turret guns, equip them with a shock mod, and enemies will die as soon as they spawn in. It's like watching something being assembled at a factory, only to be taken apart immediately. And of course, if you've equipped a few bonus bolt mods, you just leave your wallet open on the ground and money will fly into it. One last tip, if the mission ends and not all of the bolts have gone to your total yet, those bolts will disappear. So if you go to weapon select just before the timer stops, the game will finish processing the bolts that wouldn't if the challenge abruptly ended. Then you restart and repeat like a madman. So there's my tips for abusing the mechanics of the game to get super strong and super rich super quick.
Between the more developed level up system and the emphasis on modding weapons, Ratchet Deadlocked definitely has the most customizable weapon selection in the entire series. While that's great and a nice change of pace, the weapons themselves are pretty boring. Almost all of them are ideas we've seen in the previous games. Don't get me wrong, going commando and up your arsenal didn't have entirely original weapons either, but they at least threw in a couple of fresh new ideas along with reliable favorites. Ratchet Deadlocked's arsenal just lacks the personality or creativity that defined the previous entries. The most important thing is that the weapons function properly, which they undoubtedly do, but nonetheless, I can't help but find myself a little disappointed with the selection here.
I'll save most of my thoughts on the combat for later, but I will say I do actually like most of the weapons in this game. Yeah, they aren't as wacky as in past games which had a sort of Looney Tunes-esque quality to them, but that feel was slowly being lost anyway as it got more detailed and extreme looking in each game. This is just the next logical step. I'll take something like the Dwarf Vipers over the Combustor, which has appeared in many other games that follow this. Like, it's one thing when they disguise weapons that are essentially the same from game to game, your typical machine gun, bombs, rocket launcher, and sniper rifle, but then there's reusing literally the same weapon designs in multiple games because Insomniac wants to make them like some sort of symbol for the series, and that's always disappointed me a little bit. Part of the fun of earlier Ratchet and Clank games is getting to see what the next machine gun will look like, what the next rocket launcher will look like. You always want to see what the artist and Insomniac will come up with next, how they'll have managed to outdo themselves again, and how much more overkill it'll look than the previous game's iteration of that type of weapon. It's the same case here. But after using these sorts of guns in 3 other games, I understand if it starts to get old for people.
Unlike previous games where Ratchet and Clank visited a number of alien worlds to complete story missions and advance the plot, Deadlocked sees a solo Ratchet and his 2 BattleBots advancing through a series of Dread Zone gauntlets before facing off with the rival Gladiator in a tournament. Completing a tournament increases Ratchet's rank, allowing him to advance to tougher challenges. The face-offs with the other Gladiators are built up very well using the series' trademark satire of a consumer society, again giving you that extra incentive to push through the gauntlets and eventually take on the next Gladiator. Gauntlets generally take place on the different planets of the Shadow Sector, while tournaments take place back at the Dread Zone Battle Dome. The biggest problem with this game structure is definitely the pacing. The first tier of Dread Zone is by far the longest, featuring 3 planets and 2 tournaments, so it took me about 2 hours or so to beat. The other tiers only have 2 planets and 1 tournament, and they just seem to get shorter and shorter as the game went on. In my opinion, the tiers should have gotten longer and longer to accentuate the build up to the final confrontation with Ace Hardlight.
Yeah, this issue is even more exacerbated when you realize that the first Gladiator, Shellshock, is an entire world where you encounter him several times dedicated to hyping him up, while the other 3 fight you once back at Dread Zone after a few forgettable mini-challenges. Just giving each of these other Gladiators their own planet to fight them on would have been enough to round things out, I think. After you defeat Shell Shock, the game falls into a sort of rhythm, a pattern, and it starts to feel like you're going through the motions. I'm not saying they should have had a ton of more levels, but at least 3 worlds per Gladiator instead of 2 would have increased the game's length substantially.
The bigger problem is one I'll be discussing a lot in future reviews, the game's overall length. Ratchet Deadlocked only has about a dozen locations to visit, and I essentially beat the whole thing in an afternoon. It's funny that Nick mentioned the later Gladiators not having planets, because it does seem that at least 2 levels were cut from the game in order to meet a fall release. Let me be clear, game length is not the only thing that matters when evaluating a game's quality, but Ratchet Deadlocked feels somewhat lacking in content compared with the previous games. A large part of that is Deadlock's focus on combat. You know the arena challenges from going commando and up your arsenal where you just beat the shit out of waves of enemies for experience and bolts? Deadlocked seems born of a desire to flesh this out into a full-fledged game. That means that there are no Clank puzzle sections, no giant Clank beat-em-up sections, no gadget-based puzzle sections, no racing minigames, or any of the other things that made Ratchet and Clank such a diverse and unique experience. Levels take the form of campaigns where Ratchet must fulfill a series of objectives while destroying enemies and collecting bolts along the way. While these challenges can involve many things, most of the time it boils down to winding a bunch of bolt cranks or blowing stuff up while covering your battle bots. The good news is that Deadlocked implements a radar, which makes locating objectives straightforward and painless. Other challenges take the form of vehicle sections where Ratchet can mount a walking tank, a hover ship, a hover bike, or an armored car to blow shit up. These vehicles control absolutely beautifully and offer some much appreciated variety. Boss fights return in the form of competing gladiators, but with the exception of the last 2, they didn't give me that much trouble at all. Part of that's because I'm pretty experienced with Ratchet and Clank at this point, and I did pick a mid-range difficulty, but they don't really stand out much. After finishing the campaign for that world, you'll unlock a series of dread challenges, which are similar to the arena missions from the previous games. In order to unlock further worlds in the game, you have to clear at least some of these challenges to increase your dread points. These missions can range from a score attack game in the Landstalker where you try to mortar as many targets as possible to clear a score cap, to time attack sections where you drive through rings, to just clearing even more waves of enemies. To be honest though, the dread challenges are all pretty easy, and it's easier to get the points you need by just clearing every new mission as it comes out. You are allowed to grind points by clearing old missions if you want to, but you'll get substantially less points than you did the first time around.
Yeah, I pretty much agree. The only thing I'd add is that these dread missions are a great place to milk huge amounts of bolts and XP from enemies in relatively little time.
Apart from that, there's really not much else to say about Ratchet Deadlocked gameplay-wise. You unlock a challenge mode upon beating the game, as always, which allows you to max out your stats, further upgrade your weapons, purchase new mods, and play on the game's highest difficulty. This does help Ratchet Deadlocked to extend playtime somewhat, and it's certainly a fun time sink, but it's no substitute for the cut content.
A couple of other things worth noting. Skill points are handled differently in this game. There's a lot of them, and they usually involve killing a certain amount of enemies a certain way, with a certain weapon or mod or whatever. It's a good way to earn some extra bolts on the side. Collect enough skill points and you can unlock various other skins and even weather effects and mirror mode and sepia tone and the like. There's a lot of cool stuff to check out here, and I'd say it's worth getting all those skill points, at least on challenge mode.
Overall, while the gameplay is certainly a lot of fun for what it is, and I did really enjoy the ride while it lasted, Ratchet Deadlocked is probably one of my lesser favorite games in the whole series. I appreciate that Insomniac wanted to do something different with the franchise. I really do. By the time I got to Crack in Time, I was feeling a serious case of franchise fatigue, and Ultra One and Full Frontal Assault weren't necessarily the answer to that problem. But Deadlocked doesn't really innovate so much as it rips a whole bunch of stuff out and focuses on doing mostly one thing. It does that one thing with flying colors, and it's enough to carry an entire game, but it just makes me wish I was playing a proper Ratchet and Clank game instead. Yes, the gunplay was a large part of what made the previous entries so much fun to play, but it was by no means the only thing. What makes Ratchet and Clank so unique, memorable, and replayable was also the crazy over-the-top weapons, the fun platforming, the kooky gadgets, the multiple paths in every planet, the occasional Clank section, etc., etc. When you take out all that stuff, you're left with just the skeleton and not a fleshed out gaming experience. That's why I'd honestly prefer to revisit the original Ratchet and Clank over Ratchet Deadlocked. Sure, that game is messy and has its problems, but it still feels like a more complete game with a more interesting story and more memorable set pieces. Ratchet Deadlocked Deadlocked is still a good game for what it is. It has excellent visuals, the soundtrack is badass, the plot's got some great things going for it, and like I said, the core gameplay is great for what it's trying to be. It's just missing all the other little things that make Ratchet and Clank what it is. I could recommend it to fans of the series who are looking for something different, but if you're wondering whether it's worth playing before moving on to the future series, I'd say you wouldn't miss out on much if you chose to skip it.
Okay, now it's my turn to give my thoughts on the game. Like I said, this is one of the first Ratchet and Clank games I ever played, along with the original and Tools of Destruction. I didn't feel betrayed or let down or whatever when I got the Deadlocked. It was just another side of Ratchet, like the other games I was playing. I can see why you'd think this game is kinda bare bones, and you're not wrong for thinking that, but this is a game that had to be made at least once. If they didn't make this game now, they would have released a game like it on the PS3 or PSP or whatever, and honestly, for this type of game, I think Deadlocked, cut content aside, turned out about as well as a combat-focused Ratchet game could have. But that's not my big defense of this game. I acknowledge that it's a fairly shallow game that strips away almost everything else people love about the series and makes it about just shooting stuff. What I'm saying is, I don't count that as a con. This is due to one observation I've made that sort of made things click for me. Most Ratchet and Clank games, to me anyway, are basically 3D Mega Man games. Going Commando is the best example. The balance of platforming and gunplay perfectly replicates that jump and shoot man kind of thing in 3D, and there's other touches like the hover boots feeling like some stupidly overpowered dash boots from the X series, and the hoverbike races are reminiscent of the Ride Chaser segments. You get different suits of armor that increase your defense and make you look cooler, the dynamo is sort of like the magnet beam but I might be reaching there, and even the more insane weapons feel like some power you'd pick up from a robot master or a Maverick boss. Just replace the ammo count with an energy meter, and there you go, bam, it's a perfectly serviceable 3D Mega Man game. And much in the same vein, Ratchet Deadlocked is a 3D Metal Slug game. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. If you like old school Mega Man games but don't care for Metal Slug, you'll probably regard this game in much the same way. But if you do love the Metal Slug series with its minimal platforming and constant gunplay, you'll find a lot to love here. Now true, we did sort of get a 3D Metal Slug game on the PS2, but we don't talk about that here. This game is much better. The enemy types and their behaviors are pretty ideal for a hypothetical 3D Metal Slug, from the grunts to the dropships to the bigger enemies that take a lot of rounds to kill. The weapons are pretty fitting too. The Hunter Mine Launcher is how I'd imagine the Iron Lizard would ideally function in a 3D space, and the Arbiter works fine as a, rocket launcher. Even the vehicles, from the way they fire to the way they control, feel like 3D versions of various slugs, and it works. Another thing, remember how beautifully animated and detailed all the explosions are in those games? Well, the explosions in this game are glorious! And this is important, like, say what you will about this game, these people knew the parts of it they had to get right. So they made a game about blowing things up. It's a good thing then that they made the act of blowing things up feel amazing. I don't think I'll ever get tired of this game. While on the shorter side, it just makes it easier for me to replay over and over again without it dragging on. You can make the explosions even bigger with a modding system, as if they weren't big enough already. And, that's basically it. That's everything I could think of to talk about. There's a lot more to this game than people might think, and while the gameplay itself may be pretty simple, it's a beautiful kind of simplicity. It just depends on what your needs are as a gamer and what you're looking for in certain games. And if you like those shooty bang bang simple pleasure power trip kind of games like Metal Slug, you'll like this mindless shoot fest too. If it's not your thing, and you just want another traditional RNC game, then you can probably live without this one and jump to Tools of Destruction.
And that pretty much wraps up our thoughts on Ratchet Deadlocked. I've gotta say though, Nick, it's probably a good thing we did this review together. Even if it isn't one of my favorite Ratchet and Clank games, I still really enjoyed it for what it was. And who knows if I would have checked it out if you hadn't reminded me to.
Hey, no problem, man. I mean, this game's been on my to-do list for years. I was gonna do it eventually, once I found the motivation to do it sooner or later. But having someone with a different perspective to bounce off of and have this little back and forth, that always makes things more entertaining. So, thanks for having me aboard, and enjoy Tools of Destruction. Tools, everybody.
Until next time, I'm ExoParadigmGamer, and I hope you all enjoyed the collab.
NickonAquaMagna.